Attention came mainstream on this topic in the pandemic when very rapidly global supply chains just collapsed. However,
Global supply chain in the last 5 years has been through the stress test. First with the pandemic, then a ship being stuck in the Suez Canal, geopolitical priority shifts within US and outside US, goals to bring and control more of the manufacturing. And CraftCo is actually a company that is helping governments and enterprises can efficiently manage the supply chain. So administration of Trump, when there was a huge de-risking from China as a supply chain, what shifts have you seen geopolitically?
the geopolitics that we have in the world and rising tensions between the United States and other countries, including but not limited to China, you may have heard this term weaponization of the supply chain. So that is where Chinese customers are now shut off from US supply. Well, it goes in the other direction too, and the costs of it being an unsolved problem are being experienced in the millions and billions of dollars every single day.
How long did it take from the Pentagon reaching out to you? Can you give some concrete examples of the most critical or surprising data points?
So our initial approach was actually to make the product initially free. First customers really came to us, and that included actually at the Pentagon in the Department of Defense. Second big thing is the goal is to really have a 360-degree view of company, not just its financials. People tend to think of what's its revenue or how much money has it raised. And our belief from early on was that that's only one piece of the puzzle. A really interesting data set is who works there. What's the executive team like? Who are they hiring? And so we've had customers who in the quote unquote old days would take about 8 person hours. Well, our AI now does it in about 45 seconds. And we're really only at the beginning.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Startup Project, the podcast dedicated to uncovering stories, strategies, and insights behind the world's most innovative startups and the people who are building them. Global supply chain in the last 5 years has been through the stress test. First with the pandemic, then a ship being stuck in the Suez Canal, the geopolitical priority shifts within US and outside US, with goals to bring and control more of the manufacturing for every country, multiple wars. And for us, every problem is a tech problem, and CraftCo is actually a company that is helping governments and enterprises manage their supply chain by building technology that can efficiently manage the supply chain. My guest today is Ilya Levtov, a brilliant mind behind the CraftCo company. Ilya's journey has been impressive and diverse. He's a graduate from Columbia University and Stanford Graduate School of Business. CraftCo is an AI-enabled platform that provides 360-degree visibility and risk mitigation for supplier networks. They serve Fortune 500 companies, over 60 government organizations, including Department of Defense. CraftCo has not only secured significant funding with their Series B round of $32 million, but has also become an indispensable tool for procurement and supply chain professionals worldwide. In this episode, we'll deep dive into building a category-defining company, the intricacies of global supply chain, and power of building a resilient supply chain for your company. Ilya, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nataraj. It's great to be here, and thank you for that fantastic introduction.
So I think everyone sort of has seen supply chain go through these ebbs and flows last maybe I would say 5 years, starting from the pandemic. Just give our audience, what is the lay of the land of global supply chain today from your point of view?
You're absolutely right that attention really became mainstream on this topic in the pandemic when very rapidly global supply chains just collapsed. And we all saw how brittle they were. And in parallel, it was a kind of peak period of globalization, the end of 20 years of outsourcing to the lowest cost territories around the world, all creating really thin margins, really thin, just in time supply chains that were inherently brittle. And then the pandemic blew open the revelation that they really were not resilient. Since then, however, I would say that the focus has been more secular than cyclical, in the sense of when the pandemic was over, the issue didn't go away. We simply were aware that for all kinds of reasons, the complexity in the supply chain and how incredibly dynamic all elements of the global economy, and Earth's geography, how they are. They create a dynamic in which supply chains are just extremely sensitive. And we're really only at the beginning, I would say, of truly mapping and understanding them thoroughly with data and intelligence. Still very, very early.
When you talk to, I'm assuming you talk to, top leadership in supply chain within companies or governments, what is their main concern and why they're looking into, like adopting a tool or a software like CraftCo? Or what are the main concerns?
Yeah. So I'll start that by saying that kind of different angles, dimensions of risk or topics with respect to their suppliers, they get certain attention. But then after talking through a few of those, the issue really is more holistic and to do with a kind of an overall process and approach to managing a supplier ecosystem in general. So first of all, what are those specific dimensions that get people's attention? Cyber might be top of the list because of how much we're seeing cyber attacks on companies come in through their suppliers. Several years ago, Maersk had a massive supply chain hack come in through one of their suppliers. Later, Target did the same. Recent, Qantas, Jaguar Land Rover. These massive corporations where it wasn't their direct network in sort of a traditional cyber hack that took place, but it was really a weakness at one of their suppliers that then had a connection into their systems or point of sale that led to very significant costs. So the CISO is now charged, the Chief Information Security Officer is now no longer just looking at, is my network secure, but to what extent is the network of my suppliers, my key suppliers, secure? Because if not, that can really bring in a huge problem. The second big risk, an area that people are focused on, and this is particularly true in government, but it's also true in regulated industries, where because of the geopolitics that we have in the world and rising tensions between the United States and other countries, including but not limited to China, you may have heard this term, weaponization of the supply chain. We're all aware of foreign ownership, control, and influence, or FOCI. There's an increased focus on government-owned entities and state-owned entities, because the theme here is about, is this supplier of mine actually closely connected to an adversarial nation state? And if so, what risk does that bring to my supply chain? The answer can be very, very significant. And it goes both ways, by the way. We've seen the United States issue sanctions and restrictions that make it impossible for a company to sell into China, right? We're aware of that in semiconductors and other areas. And so that is where Chinese customers are now shut off from US supply. Well, it goes in the other direction too, and China can very easily say to a supplier of, let's say, battery technology, you're now no longer able to sell to any American company, and suddenly, this American manufacturer has just lost its biggest battery supplier. So that whole topic of geopolitics, sanctions, government-owned entities, and foreign ownership is another very major risk and consideration that people are focused on. After that, I would say ESG, environmental, social, and global and governance considerations. So how is that company governed? Do they pollute or not? Do they obey global labor laws, such as avoiding forced labor in their manufacturing processes? These are all, as well, there should be still very, very important topics, although I would say that the focus on ESG has arguably decreased in the last year or two. And then lastly, there's the most traditional of concerns for the supply chain, which is financial. Will that supplier be around in 6 months or 12 months? Or how financially secure are they? So those are all issues that are top of mind, rightly so, for supply chain leaders and procurement leaders in large enterprises. And then I said I would draw the thread together that while those are some of the individual risk dimensions, what's really going on is that large enterprises have not yet really been able to evolve very advanced and sophisticated risk governance capabilities that really ingest and take advantage of all the data and all the insight and all the intelligence that you would like to have about your supply chain. And in the past, it was the data wasn't available, or the pipelines were not built. It's often an issue that where they are built, they're still very disparate and siloed across the organization. You'll have certain sources with the finance team, others with the legal, with corporate development, with the IT team. Everybody in the enterprise has got kind of their own tools or data sets, and it's completely not integrated into what you would like, which is a comprehensive, holistic approach to comprehensive supplier management and supplier risk management. And ultimately, that is what Craft delivers for large enterprises.
I mean, how do you make sure? I mean, there is the aspect of like data is at different places, but then there is also the integrity of the data. Like, there might be a manufacturer in some small town in China or Shenzhen. How do you make sure that the data you're getting about them is particularly trustworthy and something that every customer of yours can actually rely upon?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a big challenge in the space. Our answer to it is that more is more. I mean, it's an all of the above strategy to get the most data and the best data and then validate it as well as possible. One of the ways we do that is by having multiple data sources for a single type of data. Take cybersecurity, for example. We have 3 premier partners integrated into our platform, in addition to our own native agent data aggregation and scanning. And since we've evolved to have not just 1, not 2, but 3 and plus sources plus our own native sources, what that gives us the ability to do is compare the output. And wherever you see the output is very consistent among multiple different data sources, you get some higher confidence that it's accurate. And yet when you see a divergence, that is usually a signal or a flag. Okay, someone's not right here. We're not sure who, but let's go take a deeper look. And that ability to throw a flag when something might be wrong. It's not definitely wrong. We don't know yet, but it might be wrong, and it focuses our attention, is a really valuable piece of the puzzle. Call it triage. Basically, a large enterprise may have 20,000 tier 1 suppliers. They don't know which ones to go focus and look at. But with this methodology, suddenly it's down to a few hundred that are showing some signal of maybe something being wrong. Now you put your human effort into investigating those keys. And if it means a boots on the ground, go pay a visit to the supplier to get the right answer, then so be it. But the value, a large part of it was in highlighting which of the suppliers potentially, require some extra exploration.
You mentioned the example of Jaguar and other companies which faced cyber attacks on their suppliers. Once that happened, how does Craft come in and sort of prevent that in future, or like prevent that in for your companies?
Yeah, well, we certainly can't do anything while we're not there. But it's quite a common story that companies that start to work with us have faced some sort of very significant disruption. And it's brought them to the conclusion that the status quo is no longer good enough. Basically, that world of having no data sources or disparate, different ones, but not centralized, and no really advanced program of systematic risk governance. Companies are increasingly recognizing that they need to address that. And that's what, creates the entire market that we're operating in, that is already large and growing rapidly because of these dynamics. It's a completely unsolved problem, and the costs of it being unsolved problem are being experienced in the millions and billions of dollars every single day. So once we do start with a customer, when we come in, the first thing we do is identify all of their suppliers. And in some cases, it may be a heavy focus on just their critical suppliers. They might be determined by level of spend. It may that there's not going to be an equal focus all the way down to some tail indirect supplier of some office supplies, perhaps, as much focus as there is on, a core ingredient for the manufacturing products that this enterprise creates. But we will create a record of every supplier, and we will enrich it to make it the most comprehensive, complete profile of that supplier that is possible, through a mix of data that's aggregated by us and our agents, that's complemented by best-in-class data from the wide array of data partners that we have, then complemented by data that the enterprise themselves has on these suppliers, such as what's the relationship, what's the spend, what product lines does that supplier feed into, and then often some data that comes actually from the suppliers themselves, for example, filling out surveys or uploading certificates. And so that whole array of first party, second party, and third party data, as we call it, creates the golden record of the supplier. And that's the basis for the service. You've now got that, and anyone in the organization can access it in all of those different functions: procurement, supply chain, finance, corporate development, legal, IT and cybersecurity, ESG and sustainability. All of those teams now have access to a shared common source of truth on that supplier. And that's the baseline. That's the baseline of our data fabric. And then we're elevating with AI. We're turning that into really rapid, highly efficient, streamlined analytics and intelligence. For example, running specific risk scans, periodic risk scans on portfolios of suppliers that used to take hours and days and weeks can now be done in seconds and minutes in our intelligent workspace.
So in the case of cyber attack example, now a Jaguar or some other company can look at their suppliers list and basically evaluate, how risky is it to work with this particular supplier, because, whether they are prone or not prone for a cyber attack. Is that how they're making decisions?
That's absolutely right. And let me expound on it a little bit more. So focusing into the cyber area that we talked about, that's so critical. Suddenly with Craft and the Craft supplier profile, there's a whole array of scores and descriptive qualitative attributions provided by some of the most advanced cyber scanning companies in the world, as well as our own native aggregation of up-to-date information, all coming together to really show the user of our product the overall risk profile of that particular supplier with respect to cybersecurity. And so obviously the first thing that happens is you see who are your bottom quartile or decile of suppliers. You are suddenly aware that these are the key suppliers who haven't recently patched their software, or are using outdated root software, or who have had passwords leaked onto the dark web. Okay, just a couple of examples of the things that you can then very, very easily spot on one or more of your suppliers that can immediately direct mitigation efforts. That's what happens on day one, and then continues on an ongoing basis with 24/7, 365 monitoring, such that even a supplier that looks safe yesterday and today, if something happens tomorrow that renders them vulnerable to a hack, that's getting alerted to you now immediately.
So this is a very interesting space. Supply chain is not obvious to a lot of people unless you work in that industry, or, you've created supply chains for a particular product. And you worked in like corporate finance, early stage at Crunchyroll. You did a little bit of venture capital. How did that whole thing translate into craft?
That's a great question. And yes, I've got, I'd say, quite a diverse, a well-rounded background, you might say. I started out in corporate finance at Goldman Sachs in London. I came over to business school at Stanford. I had held business development roles at two venture-backed startups, Spotrunner and Crunchyroll, as you mentioned, and a stint for several years as a venture capital investor with Venrock. I also held a business development role focused on enterprise partnerships at Deutsche Telekom in Germany. Now, the one thing that every single one of those roles has in common is that it had me every single day almost having to do something, which is look up information about a company. Whether I was in sales or partnerships or investments, almost every day there was some company comes across the radar, and I would need to look up quickly some information and get smart about that company. And it seemed to me that experience of trying to get smart about a company was very suboptimal. At the time, some of the sources that you had would be Crunchbase would focus on funding data for startups. Yahoo Finance would focus on financial information for public companies. But that was about it for the free sites, and everything else kind of had a paywall, whether it was Dun & Bradstreet or PitchBook. So bottom line, just very hard for an ordinary person to just get good quality access to information about companies. So that was the initial problem. Entrepreneur scratching their own itch says, can we build a better platform for this digital age that takes advantage of all of the fragments, all of the digital breadcrumbs out there? Let's hoover them up and create the most comprehensive, advanced, up-to-date profile of every company in the world. We called it building the source of truth on companies. And that's where Craft started.
I think you mentioned somewhere, or I was going through some of the blog posts. I think there are about 2,100 data streams, 500 data points, 500 plus data points per company. Can you give some concrete examples of the most critical or surprising data points, that might generate aha moments for your customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right to reference over 2,000, about 2,100 individual data points. They're all an endpoint in our API, and they are across 14 different dimensions of insight, financial and operating and environmental, social, governance, cyber, these particular dimensions. And the goal is to really have a 360-degree view of company, not just its financials, which I would argue represents sort of the most traditional view of a company. People tend to think of it, oh, show me the financials, right? What's its revenue, or how much money has it raised? And our belief from early on was that that's only one piece of the puzzle. You also want to know, where does the company operate? Tell me everything you can about its products, its services, and its pricing. A really interesting data set is who works there. What's the executive team like? What's the overall team like? And is it growing or shrinking? Who are they hiring? And so we built aggregation and collection of all of that data. Think about what you can extract from the jobs page of a company. It's not just what they're hiring for, but how that's changing over time, and even what functions they do in which locations. So,
sorry, good.
Yeah, so we've built aggregation for and structuring and validation for data across all of that territory, and I would say the most interesting thing for our customers has been not any one particular data point, but the cross correlation across the data points that in many cases has yielded some insight that no one data stream would give you by itself. For example, we found a very high correlation between high employee social media scores and engagement. For example, think of companies with a high Glassdoor rating. There's a high correlation there between that sort of highly engaged, satisfied workforce and having a lower risk of a spear phishing cyber attack. And when you think about it, it makes some sense that those companies where you've got an engaged employee workforce, that they're switched on, they're plugged in, the company's doing well, people are happy to be there, they're paying attention more. They're not clicking on, every link. Whereas these companies that have got kind of a disaffected workforce, or things are trending negatively, then you often get a higher susceptibility to behavioral type cyber hacks such as spear phishing. Another cross correlation we've seen, is looking at reduced headcount, reduced job openings, coupled with negative sentiment and chatter on social media. These three things, when taken together, can be a clue of a company starting to suffer financial hardship or financial distress that can lead to bankruptcy. And often we found those types of advanced signals giving an advanced look, even at the same time as a traditional credit rating agency report said, no risk, nothing to see here, everything's normal, no particular risk. So taking a really smart, granular look and then layering these data streams together has produced some really interesting advanced insights that at the end of the day can become predictive.
What you've said about Craft reminds me of about two products, which is like Bloomberg Terminal, which sort of also like tries to paint a picture about a company and what's happening, what could potentially happen. And also in some way, like Crunchbase does it a little bit in a smaller scale, trying to find out the data points in an area where the data points are very hard to find, which is like a really early stage startup. There's no data because they're early stage, right? So it's hard to paint a picture when it's too early of a stage. It's also interesting that you have so much intelligence data. Does it mean that when I'm trying to create a new supply chain for a new product that I'm launching, whether I'm a new company that's adopting Craft or an existing company, are you also providing a product or a service where, these are the whole options you can pick from for your new product or a service? Is that also something that you guys do?
To some extent, yes. You're talking about supplier discovery. And certainly by the volume of companies we've got, which are millions, and they're all tagged by category and a variety of industry codes. So it's very possible to look in there and see for any one given product line, yes, alternative suppliers that you may want to utilize or start a relationship with, especially in the event that your existing supplier is showing some risks or concerns that make you think, aha, I may not want to be sole sourced and dependent on that supplier alone.
Oh, what shifts have you seen geopolitically? Like the obvious shift has been, I think I can see like the two significant shifts that happened. One is, I think during the first administration of Trump, when there was a huge de-risking from China as a supply chain, so that
Yeah.
meant companies were moving away from China. That meant U.S. companies moved to Mexico, and there's a lot of diversity in terms of like which Southeast Asian country benefited from it. Like, do you have a specific insight on like which countries actually benefited from this kind of shift, and also how much of that's actually moved to the U.S.?
Yeah, well, Vietnam is one, in particular, because a lot of changes were driven by the tariffs. When that all, really hit the fan in April, one of the first things that happened is companies all trying to figure out workaround and how can they, quickly and very covertly get the supply into countries that didn't have as high tariff rates. And so there was a lot of focus on China moving to Vietnam, in the early days of the tariffs. I mean, the whole thing has been so volatile, it's been almost impossible to fully keep up with. It's almost like timing the market, which, the stock market, which most people agree is very hard, not even worth trying. Likewise, many enterprises that we talk to take a more global and holistic approach. And they say, look, I've got to optimize the supply chain over the next 10 years, not the next 10 days or weeks. And so what does that mean? The tariffs will come, they'll go up, they'll go down. That's the whole idea, as I think of them, to be volatile and to create dynamics where things stabilize in a position that's more favorable to the United States. That's at least this administration's objective with the tariffs, as far as we can tell. Taking a longer term perspective, for sure, nearshoring and friendshoring are important dynamics, which is, the other, also known as decoupling or de-risking, in particular from China, but elsewhere around the world. I mean, there's also here a build American, right? Sort of philosophy and mantra, which we think is tremendously exciting. So, bottom line, it's very dynamic. It's an environment in which every enterprise really must and very much is thinking almost from first principles again about where should my supply chain be, where do I want it, how can I have as much of it as I can, more under my control rather than less, closer rather than further away. And as we see it, that's probably a good, healthy dynamic for most companies to think about.
Why do you think Vietnam benefited? Like, is it language? Is it workforce? Like, what were the reasons do you think Vietnam really, got benefited versus other Southeast Asian countries?
That's a good question. I'm no expert there, but I would say that it was simply a good business environment. I mean, Vietnam has had one for many years. They've done a fantastic job of, having high quality, skilled labor and the ability to operate with trust. So I don't think it was hard for Vietnam to be a beneficiary, and American and European countries to just turn up the volume on what they're doing with Vietnam. While of course the point was it's extremely close to China and was able to, just very quickly get that supply across the border. So then it started to look as if it was being exported from Vietnam and not from China. Now, then it's a game of cat and mouse, right? Because the authorities start looking into it and saying, well, where did this really come from? And that's something that Customs and Border Patrol here cares a lot about, and rightly so. So yeah, it's cat and mouse. And again, I would think that most of the smart focus is on the longer term dynamics and how to land the new supply chain in a secure and resilient position as possible, unlike the last 20-30 years, brittle and just in time. And so that's just a very major strategic initiative over many years, again, not a matter of days or weeks or even months.
I mean, I think with such rich data and insights, or different diverse set of data that you have in your platform, I mean, it should be a great opportunity to leverage AI, both in terms of like how you can enrich the data and the data sources, and you can add more data sources and enrich more details on each of the dimension that you're looking at. And at the same time, do a lot more with that data itself. So can you talk a little bit about, what you're doing with AI now?
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, our business started, building a source of truth on companies and collecting and structuring all of this data long before the recent explosion in AI from Gen AI and large language models. It's just turned into a dream scenario, because what we've got in house now is a tremendous proprietary data set made up of many, many painstakingly fused together sources with a lot of entity resolution resolved, a very high quality operation for data validation and keeping the data up to date. And now we've got these incredible capabilities coming from LLMs in order to generate inference and insight and intelligence from all of that data. So it's very, very exciting. The last couple of years and this year in particular, we've really accelerated our development with an AI front end that at Craft we call the intelligent workspace, and it's focused on the procurement professional, the category manager who's responsible for the relationships with a group of suppliers. And first of all, the capability that category manager now has in the Craft Intelligent Workspace is a tool working for them 24/7. But when they come into work in the morning, they've fundamentally got at the top of a list, top of an inbox. Here's three things that happened overnight with your 100 or couple of hundred suppliers that you may want to take a look at. Here was the signal of a company in financial distress. Here's a signal of one of your suppliers vulnerable to a cyber hack. Here's one that's just shown up in a court case related to a labor violation. These are sort of needles in the haystack that our category manager simply had no ability to be on top of previously, and now they're being brought right to the surface, together with all of the data and the underlying evidence for the category manager to make a decision: is this material or not? So that's one of the things, all completely AI driven by just continuous monitoring and sort of intelligent scanning for all of the data. The second big thing is the moments at which our users are responsible to produce a comprehensive report on the state of supply chain security or risk. I mean, that is increasingly what's happening, where the chief procurement officer, chief supply chain officer, CFO, and then even CEO and board are really saying, what is the health and the resilience of our supply chain? How much risk is there in there? And are we comfortable with that? And how are we adjusting it? So when it comes to quantifying that and creating reports against it, these are the other things that AI accelerates tremendously. And just to give one data point, we've had customers who in the quote unquote old days would take about 8 person hours, like a full working day, to create a deep risk report on a given supplier covering all of these parameters. Well, our AI now does it in about 45 seconds.
And are you primarily developing models within your company, or do you see down the line developing those, or are you primarily using a particular vendor, or are you fine tuning? What are the types of things that you're doing?
Yeah, we're utilizing an array of the existing LLMs at the moment. Our own models is not something we're focused on at the moment, but I can see over time us evolving our particular own supplier risk models, especially when it comes to our desire to configure those models according to the wants of and needs of a particular customer, right? So different customers in different segments care more or less about different risks, and they have different risk tolerances and thresholds, right? That's a great example of what standard LLMs, will not do off the shelf. And yet our application very much can. That's the direction of travel for us, our own models. But to date, it's been working with OpenAI and Anthropic and Google Gemini, those three in particular, to leverage all of their AI models and run those on our particular data set, and with all of the context for the use case that we have inside Craft together with our customers.
What was your initial sort of go-to-market approach of how did you convince the first 5 customers? Because, this is like a huge problem, because to solve it at scale, it will take a lot of time, maybe a couple of years, but you still need to run a company and try to sort of validate your use case and make sure that you're not building something that no one will pay for. So what was that initial approach of, finding those first 5 to 10 customers?
So our initial approach was actually to make the product initially free. Um, Not the first company to have done that, right? If you think about product-led growth. So in those early days when we were doing our initial aggregation of data on the first several 100,000 suppliers, we put the data up for free on long, deep profiles of a company, similar to a Crunchbase profile or even a Zillow or Trulia profile of a house. Very well structured data, nicely visualized and laid out. And then what happened was that Google started crawling the site aggressively, giving us very high page rank because they could see that we had high quality, well validated data. So there was high trust in the data. And our website actually grew completely organically to appear in over 100 million search results per month and bringing almost 2.5 million people onto the website every single month to consume some information in relation to a query about a particular company. So it was really from that footprint out on the broad web that that our first customers really came to us, and that included these first large enterprises coming to us with a need in this supply chain and this procurement function. So it was in aerospace and defense initially that we were approached, first by prime manufacturers and then by teams actually at the Pentagon in the Department of Defense, or the Department of War, as it's now called, finding our data on these free profiles after they did a Google search, and then being impressed with what they saw and getting in touch with us.
That's quite an interesting inbound story. How long did it take from like the Pentagon reaching out to you to sort of like closing the contract and they starting using the product? Because it's often like, working with government is hard and it takes a long time. What was your experience of getting that done?
Yeah, we know it. Traditionally, government, sales typically take very long, and for us, it was just a particular dynamic. This was early 2020 that our first connection happened with the government. The pandemic was just in the early days of kicking off, but the need that they had was so acute, and in their opinion, the fit with what we happened to have built was so strong that we were able to close our first contract. And this was for more than $1 million in annual contract value in 94 days, just over 3 months from first initial inbound conversation through to signed purchase order. We were overjoyed at that, thrilled. It was proof that government doesn't always move slowly, doesn't have to. When the need is there and the fit is there, they can move very, very fast, and they did. And what's been even more exciting is that since then, we've grown that relationship to over, as you said, 60 organizations across 26 major agencies, mostly defense, some civilian, in the United States federal government. And it's a whole platform and service that we offer there that we're incredibly proud of, and proud to deliver to help serve their mission.
Can you talk about your business development and what is the size of the business today? I think it's almost a decade of starting the company now, or
Yeah.
and give us some numbers that you can share and talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're about 70 people today, with a little over 2/3 of that in engineering, product, and design. So the development function, and the balancing little under a third in our general go-to-market. So sales and implementation, and a little bit of shared services operations such as finance and people operations. So we see ourselves as very lean, and employing more and more AI agents to do this work by the day.
Did like AI accelerate your product development, our, go to market or general business development without hiring more people? Or have you seen any real productivity improvements within the company?
Absolutely, and across the board, across every function. So it started with the coding, as all of our engineers started adopting the LLM coding tools. Not necessarily to write the code, but certainly to check blocks, do validation, and it's just constantly growing there. But also accelerating the go-to-market function, researching prospects, qualifying, building out sales materials, building out marketing campaigns. Absolutely every aspect of go-to-market also. We're just using AI every single day. Back within our, core product, AI's having tremendous impact. It's enabling us to collect, structure, and validate more data more quickly and more cheaply than ever before. And that trend will continue. And then, as I mentioned in the AI product description, Intelligent Workspace, it's allowing us to get to answers for our customers dramatically faster. And again, produce insights in seconds that previously took days or weeks.
What does the product roadmap look like? Maybe down 2, 3 years down the lane, how does Craft going to look like? And what is
Yeah.
your outlook in general for even supply chain as an industry?
Yeah, well, we're very excited about that. Broadly, the theme with us really is supplier intelligence. So it's being a layer of intelligence that runs across the entire procurement supply chain function, enriching awareness, visibility, and monitoring on every single supplier that the enterprise has. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it can expand even further. At the end of the day, why should the intelligence layer just stop at supply chain? We're really passionate about collaboration and driving collaboration and reducing silos in the enterprise. And even in this function around procurement and risk governance, where it touches the CISO and the sustainability org and finance and risk and line of business, in addition to supply chain and procurement, the ability for our application to reduce silos and enable all of those people to log in and see the same shared truth relating to a supplier or a particular commodity or some ingredient or component that the enterprise relies on. That's really important. So the collaboration and communication layer that we've already started building, we expect to see a lot more of that. What we also have a lot of on the radar, on the roadmap, is data egress and ingress. So taking not only our data but our intelligence and enabling to transmit it across to another system that the user is working in, whether that's the orchestration layer or a CRM or a spend management system or an ERP. We also love bringing the intelligence right there to where the user is working and not require them to log into another portal. And then likewise, or reciprocally, receiving data from those systems is an important part of making the insight and the intelligence even more powerful.
I think that's a good note to end the conversation. And it's been a fascinating episode for me personally and to understand what's happening in supply chain. But one last question before we end the conversation. What has been your favorite sort of way to use AI, a specific tool, workflow, that's your favorite use case or, that has been impactful in your own life?
For me, I mean, I'm just obsessed at using the research capability to get smart ahead of a customer prospect conversation, right? As the founder CEO, I'm still heavily involved in sales and business development, which I love to do. And so ahead of every meeting, just using AI to put in all the information that I know, that we know, and then ask it what else does it know, and how to synthesize everything I should know going into the meeting. That's been my favorite function in the office. We've also used AI to vibe code an application that spins the wheel and tells us where we are ordering lunch from every day.
That's a good use case for vibe coding. Thanks, Ilya. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing all the amazing insights. I'm excited to see what you guys will do in the supply chain industry. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Nataraj, very, very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.